Good afternoon and welcome to MTPConnect's monthly webinar. I'm Tracey Wilkinson, Director of Stakeholder Engagement for WA. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all meet today. Here in Perth, that's the Woodjuk people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. First, on to some housekeeping. So please enter your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box. You can use that to communicate to other people participating in the seminar. You can submit anonymously, just click the checkbox to do so. If you have the same question as someone else, please just upvote their question by clicking the thumbs up. We'd like to note that this webinar will be recorded. You can view the on-demand web video from our website, mtpconnect.org.au/webinars. And you can also listen by subscribing to the MTP Connect podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and through our website. MTP Connect is the industry growth centre for the medical technologies, pharma, biotech, and digital health sector, and was set up to champion the growth of the sector here in Australia. Today, we're going to explore the steps to crafting a successful commercialisation funding application. And as you all well know, the landscape is competitive, and well-executed applications can mean getting the right attention from commercially focused collaborators or investors. Today, I'm joined by 4 expert speakers. Rebecca Colless is a communication specialist with Gemaker, a commercialisation consultancy. She's written many fruitful grant applications for research organisations and innovative businesses, just like yours, enabling them to take new science and technology to global markets. Rebecca will explain the strategy and the tactics that she employs to achieve her high success rate for funding applications. Andy Gehring is the CEO of BioComm and is an experienced grant assessor with an extensive track record in biotechnology in the UK and Australia. He will talk to what an assessor is looking for when reviewing an application. MTP Connect Managing Director and CEO Dan Grant will share MTP Connect's experience in developing major funding applications and some insights gained from the Biomedical Translation Bridge and the Biomedtech Horizon schemes, which MTP Connect administer on behalf of the MRFF. And last but very much not least, Professor Kevin Pfleger, the Director of Biomedical Innovation from the University of Western Australia, is an academic who has co-founded 2 startups and is well placed to discuss the differences between research and commercialisation focused applications. Thank you to all the speakers for joining us. As a quick overview for the next hour or so, first we'll hear from Rebecca, and then we'll talk one-on-one with Andy, Dan and Kevin before all speakers will be able to answer questions from the audience. You can submit your questions during the Q&A box throughout the event, and we'll get the panel to address them at the end. So let's get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce Rebecca Colless, who's now going to share her screen.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to try to lift your grant applications with some simple tips. I hope that they help because it feels that never has medtech pharma been more critical. So I want to get your great ideas out there. So my presentation is the science and art of winning commercialisation grants. The first phase that needs to be taken by everybody as a very first step is screening. I do this with clients. You need to do it yourselves. And the first question to ask yourself in the screening process is, do you have a strong strategy? So to consider its strength, ask what's driving it. A strong strategy will be driven by the market and the stage of development of your startup or business. And if it's driven by that, then that will be the foundation for a strong grant application. Unfortunately, sometimes people react to a funding opportunity only, and that's what drives their application. It isn't embedded in a strategy, and unfortunately that leads to a transparently weak application. So don't make it a reaction, make it a strategic decision. Having said that though, any new funding program arises from change in political, economic, social, technological, legal, and or environmental forces. And those are going to impact your market and your business development. So in this light, a strategic review may well be worthwhile. And so that could provoke a business pivot or a new project, and that could be suitable for a grant application. The next question I ask is, do you have a SMART project plan? That's not my acronym, you may have seen it before, but it stands for a specific project, a measurable project, achievable, and I've added in agreed by all proposing parties, that's important. It's got to be relevant and it should be resourced by you to some degree. It's got to be time limited, but also timely and time sensitive to show that it needs to be funded now. So that comprehensive and SMART project plan is the starting point for me always. It's fundamental to making a strong grant application, and it's also usually a required attachment that you'll have to submit. And I've written a list of the sort of headings that I would use to develop a project plan. So your project background, objectives, your market, the benefits, your key milestones, obviously budget, financial sustainability, how does this fit into ongoing business sustainability beyond the term of the grant, your team and capability, risk management, and evaluation. This question comes next, and it seems a little odd, but it's critical. Do you really need a grant? And there are three things to consider, because a significant grant application takes many days, and that's going to cost you. Whether you do it yourself, you need to value your time, or whether you pay someone else to develop it for you. In the process of making your application, you're usually required, almost always, to demonstrate the strong need for the government funding. And that means demonstrating that you have explored other options and they're not available to you, usually because of the stage of your business development. The third thing to consider is that if you do win a grant, there are burdensome, and I know the funding programs don't like me using that term, but they can be burdensome, reporting requirements. So consider those three things, and for all those reasons, I strongly suggest that before you think about a grant, investigate whether you can fund your project another way. There's no such thing as a free lunch. If we've passed through those phases of the screening, the next question is, do you tick the boxes? So starting by looking at the grant guidelines, you need to ask, does your organisation meet all the eligibility criteria? And these will cover things like what type of tax entity you are, when the business began, for example. Location is important depending on which government or which fund you're applying to. Turnover can be a critical criterion. The number of your staff, the diversity of your staff. Sometimes it's about how many females are on board. Also, called communities need to be represented, or Indigenous communities should be represented. IP rights. Do you own intellectual property that's relevant to the grant application? And critically, do you have board support? So if you've looked at all those in terms of your organisation, the next thing to look at is the eligibility of your project. So firstly, every funding program has objectives and intended outcomes. So you need to look at whether your project aligns with those, and preferably very strongly. So not just one of the objectives, but most, if not all of them. Then think about your project activities. Are they eligible? Again, refer to the guidelines. Some activities will be outside of what will be funded. Marketing, for example, often falls outside eligible funded activities. So you need to think about your project as a whole. How much of those activities are eligible, and the ones that aren't, how will you fund those yourself, or where will you find the way to afford those? The fourth point here, having considered which activities are eligible, will the costs of those activities fall between the minimum and maximum grant amounts? Obviously key. And finally here, can you prove access to matching funds? This may or may not be a requirement, and check the ratios because these vary. Sometimes it's 50-50, but it can be greater or less. So these are boxes that you will need to tick off. Having checked that you're eligible, that your project is appropriate too, Then you can start to think more qualitatively about whether you're going to be suitable in terms of the competition. Do you match up? Is your project of similar scale and significance to previously funded projects? So these are usually listed on the funding body's website, and it's worth spending some time having a look at those and figuring out what their purposes were, whether your project is significantly different. You don't want to be applying for funding for something that's already been funded. If you can find that it's complementary in some key way to a previously funded project, that could be really helpful. And as well, do some background research on the other teams that have been funded and consider whether your project team has equivalent sort of experience and credentials so that you have the same sort of standing or weight as previous grant winners. That way you'll get an idea of whether you really are competitive. Having passed through all that, if you've been able to answer yes to all those screening questions, then it's worth investing the time in an application. It can feel like this sometimes. It is quite an undertaking, but I'm hoping that with the following tips, you won't feel overwhelmed by it. So let's move into phase 2, which is applying. This seems obvious, but my first tip is answer the damn questions. If you cast your mind back to school, it's a little bit like doing an exam. You must read it carefully and make sure you address every part in the right place. And in some ways, it is marked a bit like an exam. So if you're responding to a merit criterion, and it will tell you on the form how many points it's worth, and if it has 4 parts, it's got 40 points, but you only respond to 3 out of 4 parts, well, you've immediately lost 10 points. The grant assessors have to apply an equitable scoring system, and you've just ruled yourself out of some key points. So be very careful to address everything. If you put the required information for that merit criterion in another part of the application, it can't count. It's got to be fair, and you've got to be organised in how you present your information. You can't just throw it all at the form and leave it up to the grant assessors to check that you've included everything they've asked for. You've got to make their job easy. They could be looking at hundreds of these grant applications. Make yours as easy for them to read as possible and make it clear to them just how grant worthy you are by making it possible for them to give you maximum points. One tip I have, a technique that I use all the time, is if my criterion has 4 points, I create 4 subheadings that match each part of the criterion. So I'm showing very clearly how I'm responding to each section. And it also breaks your text up into a much more digestible, chunked, rather than one solid page or pages of text. I also repeat the keywords in my response just to make it really easy for assessors to go, yes, they've talked about innovation, or yes, they've talked about job creation, or whatever it is. So it seems like common sense, but if you do these basic things, you will actually be ahead of many applicants, I'm afraid to say. The way I think about writing a grant application is like laying a train track. When I'm thinking of the reader, I want them to follow the train of thought that I've set out. I build their understanding from simple to complex, rather than starting with complex concepts and trying to break them down. And I try to make very smooth and logical transitions between my paragraphs, leading straight to the chosen destination, which of course is that your project warrants funding. So here's a basic idea of the flow that I would try to create. The problem is, the traditional response is, but this fails to address these aspects, whereas our solution addresses all of those, and the additional benefits are, and all we need now is a pot of money. So keep them flowing down the track, help them straight to where you want them to go rather than taking any detour. A common criterion or a common section of application forms is where you're asked what your value proposition is. the simplest way to define that is that it's the main problem you're solving or the main advantage for end users of your solution over competitors' solutions, and try and get it into one sentence. So when you're thinking about this, one way to think about customer value, what's in it for the end user, is it's the perceived benefits minus the costs versus alternatives, and costs are money and time and effort. And I've listed some value factors that you can control that contribute to this equation. So there's some under R&D, product function, how it's different from competitors, the quality and performance, and then under marketing. Branding has value, accessibility has value, service and price. And a little quote there on the side, you have to empathise with your customers to figure out what they will perceive as the benefits and costs. You'll need to prove that you have a market. So if you make any claim, like there's strong demand for our innovation, you've got to support it. You can use current evidence from reputable sources, or better still, your own market research. And just a note here, a clinical need is not equivalent to market demand, and certainly not to commercial viability. So in terms of hierarchy, you can start with web-based research. That's a good start. If you do your own end user survey, that's going to give your grant application and your business a competitive edge. If you can get positive testimonials from independent experts or beta testers or early adopters, they're worth their weight in gold. So get some as soon as possible. You've got to anticipate the concerns of the assessors and rebut them proactively, and don't make anything up, because assessors will do their due diligence. You need to be able to demonstrate team capability. You can do this by profiling your key members to show that you've got this complete commercialisation skill set. Talk about the role they'll play in the project and the values that they bring, whether it's leadership skills, stakeholder management, clinical, technical, financial, etc. And their relevant experience. What projects similar in scale and complexity have this team or key members of it delivered before? Letters of support, again, very valuable. You'll probably need to have one from your board or CEO. You've got to balance the tension between proving that you need a grant and proving that there's strong market pull. Because if there's strong market pull, that begs the question, why haven't you got a bank loan or an investor? Well, the answer is because early stage commercialisation is high risk, and bank loans and investors don't tend to like that. So that's the purpose of grants. They're there to help, if you're a startup, get you across that valley of death between seed funding and venture capital. If you're a scale up, it's to help you secure your competitive advantage. So you get to a point where you're sustaining yourself through revenue, or you're going to leverage another round of private investment. Really key point, don't say that your project won't proceed without a grant, because that tends to suggest that you're not committed to the project, or that secretly you doubt the viability. You're going to risk their money, but not yours. Better to say that it will be reduced in scale and or delayed, and explain exactly how. This is where we get a bit warm and fuzzy. It's important to tell a charming story. So don't write your application like a scientific paper. Avoid your jargons, your specialist acronyms. Don't make it too dense with facts and figures. That evidence is important, but you've also got to weave it into a story, a narrative about why this is happening. It works a charm on kids, it works a charm on grown-ups, and that's because our brains are hardwired, because in our prehistory, stories were our survival manuals. Natural selection shaped us to pay attention and to remember stories. And it's the emotional impact of a good story that makes it memorable. So you actually need to build some emotion in. So just briefly, some storytelling principles. In part of my life, I write fiction, and although I don't make anything up in a grant application, it helps me to write it well. Start with a hook, something that will surprise, maybe shock or intrigue them. Make your story relatable. Put some real people in it, end users, yourselves, a little backstory. Make it interesting. Explain the challenges and the conflicts that are built into the story of your R&D, your development to date. This is one you'll have to Google. You can apply a classic narrative structure, the hero's journey. You're the hero, you're the likable protagonist who's overcoming those challenges and conflicts, those problems. Show the moral values. Why are you doing this? What change do you want to make in the world? Employ emotive words strategically, sparingly. They're very powerful, but they add the salt and pepper, the seasoning to it. Use the active voice. In academic papers, we tend to use the passive voice, but the active voice is engineers built the bridge, not the bridge was built by engineers. It's passive. It's much more engaging, it's much more readable, and always end with some kind of resolution in terms of hope for the future and a call to action to fund your project. If you can't be charming, at least be succinct. You are allowed to write less than the word or character limits. They're very strict, by the way, so make sure you don't run over. Keep to the point. Tell the assessors what they want to know, not everything you know. Again, answer the damn questions. Eliminate sesquipedalianism, which beautifully means using long and obscure words. Cut out redundancies, empty phrases, multiple words. To find those unnecessary words, read it aloud, put it in a different colour, print it out or test it on a friend. You've got to cut it down and be succinct. And finally, if you can't be charming or even succinct, then I strongly recommend that you seek professional help early. There are many professional grant writers out there. People are using them more and more. That's part of what's making grant applications more competitive. So I'll just finish with a couple of quotes. Don't leave it too late. I love deadlines. I like the whooshing sounds they make as they fly by. Watch out for those flying deadlines. And speaking from my own perspective, poor planning on your part does not necessitate an emergency on mine. Ask for help early. I hope these tips are going to be very useful to you, and best of luck to all of you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. There are some lots of fantastic tips and strategies there for our listeners to hopefully apply in their next funding application. I really liked the train track analogy and the subheadings, and particularly making it easier for the reviewer. So, and the hero's journey is something that my son is learning at school. So it's fascinating to see the application of emotion and storytelling in science and how important that is.
Really key. Thanks, Tracey.
Thank you so much. We'll hear more from Rebecca later in our panel session. Now I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Andy Gearing, who's going to share some insights from his experience as a reviewer and assessor. So Andy, if you'd like to unmute and come a video, there you are. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you.
So can you give us an insight into your mind and talk us through what you do when you review and evaluate an application, what you're thinking about?
Okay, first of all, I think everyone should keep that presentation as a very, very good checklist of the things just to go through each time you're preparing something. That was an excellent piece of work there. So again, and I'll try and avoid too much repetition in this, but as a person who has reviewed a number of grants, either in the UK in the past and sometimes in Australia as well, for a variety of bodies, but also I review projects for startup needs or for presentation to the ultimate grant body, which tend to be venture groups or other fundraisers. So that's the sort of mindset I bring to the reviewing process. And just to remind everybody that grants are not reviewed by a single individual ever. There's always a panel issue here. So I've been asked as a single person to tell you how I go through this, but it's also as part of a panel discussion, usually at the end of a process. So the way I approach these is that the first thing, just like all applicants, you read what the grant body is asking for, and you try and find out what the strategic view of that is. Is it, and that's important, is the primary objective something like jobs, or is it a particular call for action, say around a pandemic or an emergency? So as a reviewer, I also need to be aware of those things when I'm looking at a project. And my approach to this is sort of slightly in contrast to the checklist approach, is I go into a grant, I read the grant application in full from start to finish fairly quickly, to try and get a view of what that narrative is that it's telling you and how that fits with the thing. But I go through initially and look for good. So I'm trying to find in there what it is that the applicant is putting through to the grant that is the positive. What are they trying to solve? Is that a good idea? And I take an optimistic view of their approach. And once I've got that, that gives me something to wrap my head around it then, which is the critique part of it. So then I'm going through looking for things that get in the way of them achieving what would appear to be the objective, either of their own project, and hopefully that fits in with the grant objective. So I go through, and then I'm looking at all the things that Rebecca has just laid out for you. Have you got a sensible plan to achieve an outcome? Have you got the people, the assets in place or identified, at least if you don't have them in place? And do you fit within the funding needs and requirements of the grant body? And those are, again, those are checklist items by and large. But the other thing I'm looking for is, although style, as Rebecca has pointed out, is important, there needs to be substance in there. If you don't have substance, that's going to be found out fairly quickly at some point. So then I'm looking in there for the key elements of science. So although I'm looking from a commercial point of view, without a scientific and data-driven approach, there isn't anything in that grant. So you need to make sure that you get your substance in there, your data set, and particularly if it's difficult information or it's a complex area, try and make sure you get that across in a way that can be at least understood in principle, or guides the reviewer to where to find out how to review it, if it's not just a straightforward therapeutic or diagnostic or IT solution you're working on.
Oh, that's some great insight. So are there any red flags then that you're looking for as you go through? I know you review looking for the good, which is lovely and positive and optimistic, but are there any red flags that you see and really kind of turn off?
Yeah, and so so I start with an optimistic view, and then as with life, you end up mired in the hors d'oeuvre and trying to pull the dirty bits out too. Given that you're trying to filter in a competitive process, you're looking for things that are just wrong with a grant. So things that classically throw up a red flag are, well, a weak data set is a red flag. Lots and lots of figures with modest changes and yet a conclusion which just isn't justified. So again, as Rebecca said, don't make things up. If your case is weak, it will stay weak no matter how well it's, how many times you repeat it, as some politicians tend to do. So make sure your data set is good there, and I'm looking at that. And again, if I don't understand the data, then I try and find out how to evaluate it. So that's a key thing. Something, again, avoid things that really are problematic are ownership-related issues. So do you actually have a patent? Do you own any intellectual property, which is essential for this? Or are there complex rights issues across multiple institutions that need to be clarified? And that can be a problem with some research-based institutions that have people from multiple, a hospital, a university, a research institute, making sure that's clear. And if it comes across as unclear, that's something that you would have to look into. Other things to look at would be specific project plans, lack of project planning, anything that doesn't have a series of steps from where you are to the thing you're telling us you're trying to achieve. If that's not clear, that's a problem. And if it's clear, but there are some glaring holes in there, and most people usually know there's a hole, there's no point trying to hide that. You point it out and you show how you're trying to address it if you haven't actually addressed it in your plan. So again, there's flawed bits in your logic, either from the science or from the planning. And then the other one really is that failure to mesh with a value change. You've got to show that you have thought through the problem you're trying to address with your grant application and what that means at the end. And sometimes, I mean, most people now have some concept of what commercial value looks like, but is there a market? are you up against something which is so cheap and old that there's no room for an innovative solution? You know, you could spend a lot of money on, you know, male hair loss, but a hat is quite cheap. So, you know, do you have a solution that's worthwhile in the real world? So those are classical issues, would be the value, the ownership proposition, the project planning, and a lack of clarity. If you do write a less than perfect stylistic application, as long as the content's good, then a good reviewing panel will go through that and pull out the value in it. They won't throw it away just because the font is poor or you've used some glaring colors. So you can get too hung up on stylistic issues. They are important, but don't go overboard on it.
Yeah, and if you can't be charming, at least be succinct. So, and make sure that the data's
cool. Oh, just be glamorous, you know.
So we've just got a few more minutes. Are there any specific areas that you think could or need to really be improved? If you think across all of the applications that you've looked at, what are the ones that you really wish that you could write a little note next to saying needs more work?
It tends to be the key piece of data. So without supportive, scientifically valid data in an application, you've just got some opinion-based stuff, and you're in the realm of modern politics. So choosing the data and presenting that in an appropriate way, that's the bit that a lot of applications don't do themselves favors. You know, there's usually a piece of data which that's the message. Sometimes it's too complex to do that, but usually there's something in there to get across, and to get across, bearing in mind that on a review panel, there'll be several individuals there. They will bring different experience and background, and you have to assume that there could be somebody on that panel and you are in their area. They know everything about that area, and you put a figure in there which you've simplified down to the point of being incorrect almost. So you have to have that strained balance of hitting the expert in your area by chance, or the broad majority of people on panels you regard them as sort of idiot savants. They have a strong degree of knowledge in a certain area, they have application of principles, but they may know nothing about your area at all. So it's getting that data set presented in the right way. Focus on that certainly in your application to get that through. The rest of then the other bits are really make sure you have that thought through the project planning bit.
Okay. So how important or critical is it to have that preliminary data for submitting a successful application, given also that preliminary data needs funds? So even if it's not specifically required or suggested in the grant guidelines, that's just a quick Q&A, seems to be related to what we're talking about now. So we thought we'd cover it off now.
Yeah, that's a hard one. It will depend on the grants, the wrap around the grant, what they're looking for. In some cases, if something is such an innovative approach and based on a lot of strong background data, you can use background data. So say if we have a new pandemic and you have never worked on that pandemic organism before, but you've worked on a virus, say, that's similar for a current example, you can put data in that supports your capability, your technology base, and this new problem, and join the lines up that way. So you can use data which supports that. Otherwise, try and get some sort of data set in there, and that's part of Rebecca's thing. Can you get other money to do that? In many cases, go to your institutions. That's something I think some people putting grants, and particularly out of academia, don't make use of the free assets they've got that are accessible to them. Most people in an institution have a tech transfer group of varying degrees of capability. Not everyone's wonderful, but they usually have some assets. There are databases, commercial databases you can get to from them. And the other bit is, don't forget that get mentors, experts, clinicians, even colleagues, even that you may or may not like. Get them to give you some opinion, subject to appropriate confidentiality for new stuff. Everyone has access to a network, and you'd be surprised how helpful people will be without asking you to put your hand in your pocket. People are, if you come up with something interesting, people will help you. So I think that's a key thing before your application is even considered. Even if you're thinking about something, get to somebody who might be relevant there, and they can be very helpful to you. Use your assets.
Thanks, I love that. Use your assets. Thanks a lot, Andy. On that note, we're going to move on to our next speaker from MTPConnect, Dr. Dan Grant. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Tracy.
So I'm going to jump straight into it. So in your opinion, what are the key ingredients for a successful application?
So look, Tracy, I might start by saying it's always a tough act to follow when you've got a presentation like Rebecca's made, and then you've got Andy Gearing coming and talking about his experience. Just to set the scene, I've been pretty successful in securing grants, or at least had some level of success over the last 25 years, have either led or played a major role in applications that have secured more than $250 million of grant funding in Australia. And that's been funding from state, federal government sources, the NHMRC, the ARC, CRCP, CRCs, and other sources. And I think the success, or the success that I've had, really comes back to an experience I had at Monash University when I first came to Australia as a young postdoc. I worked in the Ritchie Centre for Baby Health Research, now part of the Hudson Institute, with Professor Adrian Walker. And as a young postdoc straight from Canada, I always found it amusing that I'd spend my entire Christmas holidays writing NH and MRC grants. But what was even more amusing was that Adrian had a belief that you needed to focus on the first page, probably for about 80% of the time you were writing. And it was all about getting the story correct and making sure that, as Rebecca has said, that you hook people early on in what you're trying to do. And so we would spend weeks writing the first 1 or 2 pages, and then spend a very short period of time filling in the detail around the research plans, because that was our bread and butter. And so I think for me, the success in writing grants and securing grant funding is all about the story. It's about making sure that you can demonstrate the value that your grant is going to produce. It's about telling that story so people don't turn off. And as a reviewer of grants for a whole host of programs, those that we run for the MRFF and ARC grants and other grants, if a reviewer struggles to get the story in the first few paragraphs, it's unlikely that they'll ever get the story. And I think you can then have as much data as you want piled behind it, but if you don't get their buy-in early, they're lost. And so I would suggest that people spend a lot of time on what the story is. I think back to a current affairs program in Canada called W5, which is, has been running for 55 years, I think. And W5 stands for who, what, where, when, and why. And those are the key things that I think your grant application has to address. Who you are, what the team is, what you're going to do, where it's going to happen, when are you going to do it, and of course the big question, why is it important? And I think Rebecca's touched on many of those things. So for me, it's a story. It's about what differentiates you, and if you can write that well, then I think you have a good chance of standing out in all the other applications.
Yeah, great. So I think you might have just covered this one, but based on our experiences at MTPConnect with administering grant programs through the BTB and the BMTH, are there any specific areas that you think applicants need to spend more time on? So beyond that, is it really just those 2 pages, or are there any other bits that you really wish people would spend a bit more time articulating and describing well?
No, look, I think there are a whole host of areas where people need to spend more time. So when I say it's the first 2 pages, I think you do have to put effort into the rest of the grant. One of the things we're seeing in a lot of the grants that we review, both for our programs and other programs, is that Australia has been particularly good in creating business accelerator programs, which are starting to teach people the words needed to describe a development program and the words needed in regards to regulatory pathways and whatnot. But we're starting to see a lot of applications that are full of, and I think Rebecca used the word jargon, I'd use MBA speak. And so they come across as an MBA program or assignment. And having an MBA, I know how to write those, but they raise a red flag. And Andy talked about about the fact that there are problems with all applications. I'll go back to an expression that Stan Yucatan used to use, which is all dogs have fleas. And I think in your application, you shouldn't try to hide the fleas with MBA speak. And it becomes very obvious very quickly for reviewers that the substance isn't there. And so again, I think Andy and Rebecca also pointed out that you know, exaggerating what you've got or what you've done isn't a good idea. And we often see claims from applicants that they're well engaged with pharma or medtech companies, and those companies have expressed high levels of interest in partnering with them if only they could do X, Y, or Z. But the reality is often those claims aren't justified. They're 1 minute conversations that the individual might have had with a pharma company at a conference, or they might have been a half-hour session that they did at Bio, but there's no real buy-in from the companies at that point. And so I think you have to be really upfront with what you've got, what you've done, and not try to exaggerate where you're at. The other thing I would encourage people to do, and Rebecca talked about this in her last slide, is start early. You know, there are deadlines for grant applications for a reason. You have to meet those, and we often see that people, you know, miss deadlines because they didn't realize that their word count was in excess of what the box would allow, or they failed to collect one piece of critical information and they couldn't submit their grant. So again, I think we need to spend more time on planning these grants, spend more time getting them into the form, making sure the word count works, so that when you hit that button to submit them, you don't find out in the last 2 or 3 minutes that somewhere in your application, one word count is over the limit. So again, you know, being upfront with what you've got, providing strong evidence, Andy mentioned that, being planned and prepared so that you're not doing it in the last minute, I think is really critical.
Yeah, I agree entirely. So given that we're soon going to be announcing details about some further funding opportunities through the Targeted Translation Research Accelerator for Diabetes and Cardiovascular Disease, which we get lots of questions about as the stakeholder engagement team, what pieces of advice could you give our audience today just to make sure that their application is as competitive as possible before the application has gone out?
So I think one of the things, and we might have talked about it earlier, Rebecca might have mentioned it, is starting to think about who your partners are early on. Whether it's the TTRA application that you're applying for, or it's an ARC ITRP program like a training center or research hub, applications that are really strong have strong partners. And there's partners that are picked from across the country. They're not just your mates across the hallway in your university or your organization, but rather you're more thoughtful about who you're partnering with. And so I would encourage applicants to start thinking about who are the best people to partner with in Australia. Often we'll see applications coming across our desks that you know, we know there are other people working on those areas that should have been or could have been involved and weren't approached. We know there are companies that could have been involved but weren't approached. And so again, it's about timing. It's about starting to think about who are the best people, about forming those collaborations so that you can really write a competitive application. And so I would encourage people, again, whether it's for the TTRA process that's about to begin or any other processes, to not leave that collaboration piece to the end. MTPConnect is here in the sector to help organizations find companies to engage with around grant applications, and we can make connections. But what we can't do, and Rebecca said this, is we can't find companies to partner on ARC linkage grants or CRCP grants if we don't have enough time. We can't help you. And so coming to somebody, asking for them to help find partners for a training hub when there's only a week or two left before the applications are due isn't going to work. So I would encourage people to start, you know, being aware of what the applications or what programs are likely to be called. Start planning well in advance. You know, to put in a good training hub application or research center application, that process can take months and months to start to bring it together. And often the time you have between the announcement of the grant and the closing of expressions of interest is very short. So you have to start doing that work now. And I'd encourage people, not just for the grants we have, but for all of the grants that are out there, start thinking about it. Be prepared, because you don't have a lot of time once the announcements come out.
Thanks a lot, Dan. And speaking of time, unfortunately, we're at the end of our session with you, but please stick around and we'll get back to you in the panel session. Thank you very much for those insights from MTPConnect. And lastly, I'd like to welcome Professor Kevin Pfleger from UWA, who's kindly agreed to share some pearls of wisdom from his experiences in both the academic and the commercial worlds. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Tracy.
So what are the main differences between academic and commercialisation applications?
Well, as has been touched on by Rebecca, they're really about different stages of development. So your academic grants tend to be about increasing knowledge. So they need to be about quality applications that have a clear rationale and hypothesis. They're about the feasibility of that work being done, and they're about having a really strong team. So all of those are critically important. But people are generally not looking for a strong intellectual property position at that point. They're looking for hypothesis-driven research. Whereas a commercial application, really this is a later stage. This is looking for proof of concept once initial research has been done. It will be looking for the development pathway. What is the market? Is there a need? Is there a clinical need, but also is there a market? As Rebecca said again, just because of the clinical need doesn't necessarily mean there's commercial viability. What's your regulatory strategy, the reimbursement environment? There's a whole host of things that need to be looked at, freedom to operate. So these are things that reviewers will be looking at with these commercialization applications, as well as the quality of the team and the quality of the science underpinning it.
Yeah. So do you have a different approach when you start a research application as opposed to a commercial focused one?
Yeah, and as Dan alluded to, I mean, it really comes down to the planning. And with commercial applications, if you're an academic, commercial applications will be involving partners. If you have a linkage grant, for example, it is all about those partnerships. So as Dan said, start early, build those relationships. Don't wait for the grant application process to start, but actually build those relationships over years it may take, and actually have a strong alignment between your research and the outcomes that the industry partner is looking for. There's no point thinking, oh, this is wonderful, this grant application opportunity aligns with my research. I'll just go and find an industry partner to come on board so that it looks good and I can get my grant funding. That's not how it works. Commercialization applications are all about the alignment of industry partners and the academic research environment. Can you, as an academic, with your research skills and your talents in your team, really progress the needs and get outcomes for that company? So this is often about milestones. This is about timeliness. So it's about getting inflection points, getting to an inflection point for that company and achieving an aim so that company can develop further.
So some subtle differences there then between,
absolutely,
yeah, but important. So are there any elements of academic grant applications that are useful when you're preparing a commercialization, if any?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Rebecca touched on this. I mean, the philosophy about storytelling, the philosophy around hooking that reviewer. At the end of the day, as Andy said, you are going to a panel. And so you need to be convincing the person that is initially reviewing your grant. You need to convince that person to be the champion for you at that panel. So you need to hook them, you need to excite them, you need to get them to be an advocate for you at that panel so that they're really in there batting for you. Because this is highly competitive, the success rates are low, there are a lot of applications, and if you don't have that champion in the room, you can't be in that room. You have to convince somebody else to be the advocate and be the advocate for your grant over every other grant that they've seen in the last weeks that they've been reviewing. So you need to really nail that.
Yeah. So which do you find easier? Are they academic applications or commercialization?
Personally, I like commercialization grants because I like building relationships with people, and I like building those connections, working with people. I think it's wonderful to work with people from different backgrounds, from business and other areas, building those relationships, getting in that alignment. And then once you're ready to go and you're all aligned and you want to do the work, then writing the application. And generally that means that you'll have a higher success rate. Whereas if you're doing a purely academic grant, it goes to a panel, you don't know who the panel are, and you don't have really much control over the process beyond that. So I actually like commercialization applications, and I like building those relationships.
That's really, really useful. So what are your key tips or pieces of advice that you just want to tell everybody that you think are really useful when you're preparing a commercialization application?
Well, again, I mean, Rebecca's presentation was fantastic, and I would encourage everybody to go through that in great detail. I mean, but some of those key points, it is about starting early, building those relationships. If you have those relationships and a grant calls out, you can pick up the phone to a CEO of an organization and say, this application has come through. We've been talking about this for a while. Are you happy to support it? And they'll say, yeah, fantastic, great. You can't just get on the phone to a CEO and do that without that prior relationship being built. So that's incredibly important. The other thing as well is grant writing takes time. There's a lot of boxes to fill, and you will get down into the weeds of writing that application, and you'll start to convince yourself this is an amazing application. And it's critically important to get somebody else to read it. It really, really is, because you can end up writing an amazing application, but it may not actually correspond to the objectives of the grant scheme. And a number of times from my experience writing fellowship applications and other applications, I write what I think is an amazing application, and then somebody reads it and says, well, this is a great application. It won't get funded. It won't get funded because it looks like a grant that is applicable to another funding body. Its objectives are great, but not what the grant funding body on this occasion has asked for. And that feedback is critical, and it means you can pivot, and it means you can actually apply that feedback and improve your grant. So don't just give your grant to somebody that's going to read it and say, oh, it's wonderful, it sounds great. Give it to somebody that will give you candid advice, that you know well enough that will give you that feedback. Don't take offense when they do, and take that feedback on board. It's really important. Don't get offended. Don't take it personally. They're trying to help you, and take that feedback on board, because I guarantee it will make a massive difference to your grant.
That's some really, really great advice there. I think it's always important to take the failed grants and learn from those experiences. And I guess that's what we're hoping to do today, is to share some of those learnings with other people. And I think on that note, I'm actually going to say thank you to you for these really great insights and for your time today. And now we're going to open the session up to Q&A and try and get through as many as possible today. So please continue to send your questions through in the Q&A chat box and upvote those that you are most interested in hearing. And I'm just going to ask all of the panelists, so Rebecca, Dan and Andy, to unmute and appear on our screens for our virtual panel discussion. So the most popular question, which I know Dan has already touched on, but I'm going to do it again, ask it again, is that of the grant applications from the BTB and the BMTH that failed, was there a common thread or a particular weakness that you could comment on?
Thanks, Tracy. So that is a question that we often get, because people obviously want to improve their applications. I think that applications to any program sort of fall into three categories. There's those that are obviously fundable. There are those that are fundable if there was enough money. And then there's a group in the bottom ones that are obviously not fundable. It's those bottom ones that we see common themes. Common themes, and Kevin touched on this. One of the biggest things we see is people writing a grant application or repurposing a grant application for a program where it just doesn't align. And many of our programs have specific therapeutic areas that they need to address, and or therapeutic modalities that they need to deliver. And people try to dress up their application as if it fits. And the reality is the reviewers like Andy and others who have reviewed these types of programs for years and years read through that very quickly. So I think alignment is one thing, and please, you know, if it doesn't align, save yourself the efforts. To Rebecca's point, don't apply. I think the other thing that we see is that the technology readiness level, the TRL level for our programs is supposed to be at a point where, you know, you have a prototype, you're moving towards sort of TRL 4 and beyond. And often we get, again, things straight out of an ideation session where there are no data, there's no prototype, there's no experience. And again, it's dressed up as if it's there, but when you read it, you can see that it's not there. And I guess the final thing that often rules programs out is that they're put in by teams that don't really exist. And I know there might be a question about teams elsewhere, or maybe it was a conversation you had with one of the other panelists, but you know, teams are really important, and we often get long lists of people with no indication of what they're really going to contribute to the program, or we don't get any list of people and we get one or two chief investigators with nobody on the team who has experience in commercialization, IP, regulatory, reimbursement, or anything like that. So those are sort of the four key areas: alignment, data, TRL level, and teams that sort of rule people out fairly quickly.
Yeah. Do any of the other speakers have any comments to make on some of those threads that Dan's mentioned? No? All right. Andy?
I think from the early stage, the ones that are obviously not fundable, those are the fairly good ones. I think the key thing for people is if you're in that fundable but you're not hitting that obviously fundable category, then paying attention to a lot of the things that Rebecca has listed down there, making sure you address every possible minor weakness can make the difference between making a cut into the whatever the few that are funded is. There can be some very subtle differences between making it and not making it. So again, do what you can that's in your power to fit.
Okay.
I would also say, Tracy, that Dan's point, it's about experience as relevant. So you could have an amazing group of professors, but if none of them have commercialization experience, that's a gap. And so it's not just the quality of the team, but also the relevance of their experience.
Yeah, really important. So what chance do startups have for a successful application competing with other well-known research organisations and SMEs? So are they considered at all? Was one question from the audience. I don't know who wants to take that. Dan?
So, I might just start because we run some granting programs. I would say that all applications are reviewed equitably and fairly. If you look at the distribution of programs that we've funded and distributions that other programs fund, typically you'll see that there are often startups who are funded, there are SMEs that are funded, there are listed companies that are funded, there's research organizations. I think, again, it gets down to the quality of the application, the data you've got, the people that are involved. So when you've got that quality, the right people, then I'd encourage people to put in good, strong applications.
Yeah, I work with startups a lot. And depending on the program, I mean, some of them are very much designed for startups. So the Accelerating Commercialisation grants, for example, all my successes there have been with startups. So it's, again, just looking at how you align with the eligibility criteria and the objectives and see whether you're suitable. And that's the basis that you should be considered on.
Just coming to one question here from Mark. During COVID-19, did you see a preference to supporting existing grant winners in the past reapplying for follow-up rounds? He's saying that they've seen this in a number of grants. So if so, any specific advice for new applicants working out whether it's worth the investment to apply?
So again, Tracy, I might just comment because I can comment on our programs, and again, we assessed all programs based on the applications we received and didn't have a preference to refund programs that had previously been funded. In fact, in many of our programs, we're not allowed to provide second funding into a program, particularly as it relates to the Growth Center projects that we fund through our Growth Center Project Fund. So again, I think it really is all about the application that you're putting in, and you know, it is often hard for companies or organizations or individuals to break into a new field, but if you have those strong applications, if you follow Rebecca's you know, slide deck, your chances are vastly improved.
So on that slide deck, Rebecca, could you give us some insights into how you can tell how you can identify the people and the projects that you choose to take on? So I know you screen at the beginning of your process, and you've said that you don't actually take on every person that comes to you to write a grant with them. So how do you tell between someone that you can help and someone that you can't?
Well, look, I very much follow that checklist. I start with the grant guidelines. I look at previously funded projects. I think, you know, key points have been made about partnerships and who else is on board. I mean, if I look at previously funded projects and I immediately find, well, someone else is doing this already, that's a big red flag for me, because they haven't even checked that. It suggests that they aren't aware of the market in terms of competition. You know, grant writing, it does take a lot of time. Like an accelerating commercialisation grant just for the large text responses is between 40 and 100 hours of work. And that's, you know, after you've developed the project plan and you've got all your partnerships in place. That's just producing the text responses. So, you know, I don't want to waste people's time and money. I think that's unethical. So I only take on people that I think have a good chance of winning. And it really is just going through that checklist. It's looking at their team capability. It's all the things that we've been talking about. So I very much assess them. And that's, I mean, that is actually probably more than 50% of why my hit rate is high, because I weed out the people who I don't think it's worthwhile putting in an application for. And then, you know, the applying process can then just tell that good story clearly. I mean, this has been touched on too, I think, by Andy, that, you know, and this is where journalists can tell you, you don't bury the lead. I had one applicant who on the 4th page of dense text finally told me just how many carbon emissions this was going to reduce, for example. But he'd bored me with all this chemistry for the first 3 pages. And I was like, I don't get the point at all. And then finally it was like, it'll be like taking every car off the road in Canada for a year. And, you know, that's when you go, oh, there is a story here. So it's a combination of looking at the evidence, the capability, the connections, and then the story. What is really going to be motivating to the funders.
Has anyone else got any comments on that one?
I think, yeah, key point for that, again, in my commercial, we're working with people, but also looking at startups and putting grants in. There has to be somebody who wants this to happen, not just for the money that comes into the lab. There has to be some element of champion in there that wants to drive this along. If you're part of a loose consortium that would just like a bit of money, that will tend to come across somewhere. And even if it doesn't come across on paper, it will come across when you're talking to other funding agencies or the venture groups. And that you have to be very careful. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to be likable. Being able to work in groups and teams usually involves likability, but there are some extremely unpleasant and loathsome individuals who have done very successful startups. You just don't want to work with them personally. So likability, teamwork is very, very good, but driving a project along and wanting it to happen, you need a champion.
Yeah, commercialization never happens because one person drives it. It's got to be, you've got to have those collaborators. Just the other point I was going to make, and I think particularly in regard to researchers, is that they will often be very, very strong on clinical evidence and weak on market evidence. So, and strangely, scientists who are very, very loath to make any kind of statement about their clinical data, they're very, very cautious, will make sweeping statements about how big the market is with no evidence whatsoever. So it's funny, it's like they switch off their scientific brain suddenly when it comes to, you know, saying how many people out there are actually going to pay for this thing. and buy it. So it's a balance between those two things. And if someone's going to be a commercial success, they've got to have that sense of market and have done the research.
Really a team sport, commercialisation is
Absolutely
how I think about it. And on the team, is it possible to be successful without a well-known expert? Yes, nodding heads.
Again, it comes down to the team and the feasibility. People are looking, can this work be done? Do you have the right people? And it's a team sport. So doesn't necessarily mean you have an amazing striker. I'm obviously come from the UK and think about football, but you know, it's about a team, right? Do you have defenders? Do you have midfield? It's a full team. It's useful to have goalkeeper occasionally as well.
But again, getting key opinion leaders in areas on side with you is obviously very important. And again, usually in most people's network, you're no more than one step away from somebody with insight and influence. You ideally want insight, not just influence. But use those things. If somebody big in your area likes something, the chances are they will also be aligned in some way with other commercial activity, either with big companies or they've done startups before. Use those contacts and use your assets, get to them.
And for me, the key is to make sure that they're committed to actually contributing to the project. So again, not a long list of Nobel laureates and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, but rather those who have credibility, who are key opinion leaders, but who are also engaged and willing to give you the time needed to make a difference in the program.
It can actually count against you if you put a really big name on and it's not clear that they're really part of it, because reviewers are cynical and they'll see right through that.
Cynical reviewers, hey Andy?
I've done a bit of reviewing as well, so,
Yeah,
so I'm not just talking about Andy.
So, and we've got a number of people asking if they can have Rebecca's amazing presentation. So just acknowledging that we will be able to share that. And I believe that we will be able to connect you with gemaker as well, if you're interested in learning more about what a professional grant writer can do for you and your opportunity.
Just a comment on that. It's expensive to have someone do the full service, but you can get them to do a review. So there are simpler services. So just a high level review or get help with particular parts so that it can be accessible to people who can't afford the full service. And to get that outsider who I guess Kevin was talking about a bit, to ask those really objective questions and to really put you on the spot and to find those weaknesses that the grant assessors will find too before you submit your application.
Yeah. So would you, here's quite a specific question. Would you recommend the TTO member being included into your commercialisation grant application? I don't quite know who to throw that to. Rebecca, is that something that you often see?
Sorry, can you ask the question again? I didn't quite get the acronyms.
The tech transfer office. So like the commercialisation team from the university or the MRI.
How important is it to have them involved?
Yeah, so would you usually include them in the team when you're writing your application? If
they're truly involved, yes, because that will build evidence that you've got the commercialisation skill set. Yes.
Yep. And Kevin, is that something that you've got experience you could speak to?
Yeah, I think again it comes down, are they truly involved? I mean, I think it's incredibly important to engage the tech transfer offices, and there's a lot of expertise in universities. To Andy's point, people don't always access. And a lot of technology transfer officers sit on boards of spin-out companies from universities. So they have a lot of knowledge and tap into that. So yes, if they're genuinely involved, get them involved and list them, but don't just list them without actually telling them more, you know, just as a token effort. It's about including them as a genuine member of the team.
And no shopping list names.
Absolutely.
Right. Andy, did you have anything further to add to that one?
Well, that's something, because it's an asset that's available to you that costs you nothing, you should be talking to those people anyway. You will find that usually in any moderate size institution, there will be a team of people, and make your own mind about how useful they are. If you find a useful tech transfer group or an individual with that, that's your asset. They're your go-to people to sound things off early, to get bits of advice, maybe even access to small amounts of funding that some institutions have available for this early stage stuff. Get them on your side. If they're against you, that doesn't help. They should be aware of your thinking even before you've hit the commercial button. Just use them, and in some cases embrace them. And
coming back to your thinking about empathy and comments about empathy, tech transfer officers have to cover the whole university. They're very busy people. Talk to them early, put in invention disclosures so they know what you're doing, and have constant conversations with them. Don't just contact them on the last day before the grant's due and expect them to jump on your grant, because they'll be busy.
Yeah, definitely agreed there. So unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time for today. We finish up exactly on time here with our webinar, so that everyone on the East Coast can, I think, go and have some lunch, and I can go and have my first coffee for the day. I took a lot away from that discussion, and hopefully everybody in the audience did as well. If you have any questions that you really burningly want answered, please reach out to us using our contact details. So it's info@mtpconnect.org.au, and we'll do our best to see those answered or connect you with one of our presenters today. So I think some of my main takeaways were to answer the damn questions. I'm going to hear that in my head all the time now, I think. Thanks, Rebecca. And I think also really importantly that clinical need doesn't always equal market demand or commercial viability. And that doesn't actually always take you a lot of money to find out. It's really about questions, and as Andy said, tapping your network, your tech transfer, and the capacity that you have there. I think all of those things, that some of the things that the applications tend to be poor on are not necessarily things that you always need a lot of money to be able to improve. I really like the idea of using the storytelling principles to create that emotional impact. And when I think about it, that should always be possible in health and medical innovations, because we're all working to improve someone's lives. So what's more emotive than that? So I'd like to, at this point, give a real special thank you to Rebecca, Kevin, Dan, and Andy for joining us. And I'd really like to thank all of the audience for participating, for joining the webinar today. It'd be really great if you could complete the anonymous feedback form. The link will appear, I'm told, when you log out. It only takes 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey, and this feedback really helps us plan future events. So again, for further information, please reach out via email. That's it for today. So until next time, thank you to everybody, and we will end up there.
Thanks, Tracey.
Thank you, Tracey.
Thanks, everyone.